A right delayed is a right denied. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is our freedom under siege? Joining us this evening on the show are Tyagi Pavirina, Amnesty International South Asia, Attorney at Law Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, Human Rights Lawyer, Attorney at Law Migara Dos, Civil and Public Law Practitioner, as well as Attorney at Law Leni Fernando, representing the Samagi Jana Balavegia, and also a Murto Municipal Councillor. On to my immediate right is Shinaya Darigama. On to my immediate left is Ruhaza Irfan, joining us for the first time on Face the Nation. Nice to have you on the show, Ruhaza. And on to my far left is Charlotte Benedict. You can SMS your questions to 071 558 7788, and we would love to take your questions as the show progresses. Let's start off tonight's show with Tyagi Pavirina, Amnesty International South Asia. What are your thoughts on the current democratic framework in the country?
Well, we've obviously seen a lot of human rights violations in the past year. Let's just take a recap, right? We've seen from the beginning of the year, the civic space has been shrinking. For example, starting from as early as late March, there's been protests around the economic crisis, really, that has brought hundreds of people to the roads. And after that, we saw it build up to the point that there was almost a permanent peaceful protest site called Gota Gogama from around April. And let's look at it now. Where is the protest movement? There have been 2 people who've been arrested. They've been issued detention orders under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for their acts of protest. And so looking back, I think we can see excessive use of force against protesters, the freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly being restricted. And these are fundamental rights violations.
Tyagi, I recollect on the 4th of October 2022, just over a month ago, your organization said, we are near total breakdown. 1.5 months after that statement was made, how do you view the current situation in the country?
So that report was actually around Sri Lanka's economic, social, cultural rights. For example, the right to food, right to health, right to social protection. Where are we at? People are down to 1 meal a day. And especially vulnerable communities like the Malaya Tamil community or the urban poor, they're suffering a lot during this time. And we're now seeing even the social protection spending, it might shrink the number of people. I think it was something like 4 million people who were eligible for it before, and now they're planning on shrinking it. While they might increase the quantum of, that they pay, but at the same time they're going to shrink the recipients. So how is the population going to take this? These are important questions that we need to ask, and the budget was just presented this week, and how people are going to cope in the coming months.
Tyagi, because you have a minute to go as far as your opening round remarks are concerned, I'll pose another question to you. In 2009, there was a self-imposed censorship in the country. Freedom of expression was under tremendous stress at that time. How do you view the current framework in which media freedom is taking center stage?
So I think we have to look at it in terms of the past few years, right? Even post-2009, since the end of the war, there were serious violations of human rights. There were murders of journalists, Lasantha Eknaligoda, Prageet Eknaligoda, Lasantha Wickramatunge and Prageet Eknaligoda. And after that, I think especially after 2015, we saw a marked change in that space. But it didn't mean that people were free to really talk about what they felt like, because the ICCPR Act, for example, were being used against people like Shaktika Satkumara. But I think there was that impression that there was this freedom of speech, and that genie is kind of out of the bottle. And now, even after 2019, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. So people are really pushing back against any restrictions on their fundamental right to free expression.
Thank you very much, Tyagi Pavirina, representing Amnesty International South Asia. I now move attention to Attorney at Law Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, Human Rights Lawyer Gehan, is our freedom under siege?
Yes, it is. And I think there's a fundamental problem in terms of how we understand freedom in this country. So, if you think about freedom, freedom should be the norm. It should be the default position if you're a citizen. And a restriction on freedom should be the exception. So, often when we think about freedom in Sri Lanka, freedom is actually the exception. And the restriction has become the norm. And we have to work hard at switching that. And I think the problem in this country is that the state is under the impression that it is giving a gift to citizens when it permits citizens to act in the way they want. Freedom is essentially the autonomy and the ability to act as you please. And that ability to act is not without restrictions. There are restrictions, but those restrictions are the exception. The restriction has to be justified. And the state is in the business of restricting first and getting the citizen to justify freedom. You understand the problem, right? So there's a flip in terms of what should be the norm and what should be the exception. And we have to really work hard at getting the state to understand what freedom is. And I think if you look at what has happened over the last few months and more recently, I'm seeing something interesting emerging. There's a maxim that you say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if I go on the street in a zone that happens to be 40 kilometers an hour and I don't see the sign and the police stop me, I can't say I didn't know. I'm usually driving at 50 kilometers an hour. I didn't realize I had just entered a zone. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. We apply that to citizens all the time. But do we expect that of the state? How much are we, exposed to the fact that the police routinely misapply the law? They are ignorant of the law. And one classic example is this ludicrous reasoning that we must get prior approval to go for protests. Now the section in the law is very, very clear, extremely clear. Section 77 of the police ordinance. You must give prior notice before going on a protest. There's a difference between approval and notice. Now, who is going to explain the law to the police? Surely the state has to have its apparatus in place so the law is actually known by the law enforcement officials so they don't misuse the law. So every time someone insists on a prior approval for the protest, they're actually violating the law because the law does not require that. It's prior notice. So I think we need to do a couple of things. And I think civil society, the media community, the legal fraternity, all of us have a responsibility to create a discourse in which the state understands fully that freedom is the norm, restrictions are the exception. And we need to expect the state to know what the law is so it can enforce the law correctly.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law, Dr. Gehan Tilaka. I now move attention to Attorney at Law, Mika Radosh, a civil and public law practitioner. What are your thoughts on this subject that we're talking about?
First of all, thank you very much for having me in this show. Well, looking into the topic that our freedom is under siege, we have to look at it in context. Since March 2020 in Sri Lanka, there was a civil movement where the people came out to the streets, protested and raised their voices against a particular system. That is the political system and establishment and the political culture that the people despised for several decades. Their disappointment in our political culture, their frustrations about our political culture were expressed since March 2020 onwards in a very rigorous manner. And it came to a peak in July 9th, where the people or the people's civil movement managed to oust the sitting president of the country. Now, what happened thereafter is something that we need to very closely observe and try to understand. What happened from the 22nd of July was that the very political establishment and system they opposed and fought against reasserted its power in the country once again. Then we have to see what happened thereafter. What happened thereafter is the political system retaliated against the people who agitated against it. And that political system, the establishment in this country is now enforcing or are implementing a repressive state mechanism against the rights of the people. This repression comes in the form of political repression, civil repression and economic repression. We see the Prevention of Terrorism Act being used in a very draconian and rigorous manner against the citizens of this country. We have examples of Galveva Siridhamma and Wasantha Mudilige, who were activists and leaders of the people's movement from March onwards, being arrested and detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. On the 18th of this month, their period of detention would complete 90 days. We do not know what will happen thereafter. And moving on, the civil rights of the people is curtailed like never before. People cannot even walk on the streets with banners. These are the fundamental rights of the people. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly violated in broad daylight. So this is a very pathetic situation that we have as citizens are facing at the moment. Apart from political and civil repression, we also have economic repression on the masses. If you look at the basic outline of the budget speech yesterday, the basic assumption in the budget speech is for 74 years, the people have not worked hard enough, and that therefore the people need to be taxed more, and that their indirect taxes should be increased. But the question is there equality in this taxation? I think not. I think there's inequality in this taxation regime also. We have corporate entities, BOI projects, which are given tax holidays for long periods of time. We have corporates that engage in a practice of misinvoicing and undervaluing the exports. So is this fair? I think people's rights politically, civil and economically are suppressed by this government, so definitely their freedoms are under siege.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Mikara Dosh, civil and public law practitioner. Mikara, this is your first time on Face the Nation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
With both arms open, we now move our attention to Attorney at Law Lehini Fernando, representing the Samujana Balabegya, as well as a Murtua Municipal Council as well. Lehini, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, so it says that one of the Supreme Court judgments, it says stifling peaceful expression of legitimate dissent today can only result inexorably in a catastrophic explosion of violence some other day. So I'd like to ask the question now, this freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, we see repeatedly the citizens' rights which are granted by the Constitution of Sri Lanka for the citizens are being curtailed. There's repression, there's oppression, and when citizens come out to express their dissenting views, there's police brutality, and people are not given the freedom to express their thoughts. Where are we leading to? Or where is all these things leading to? I mean, as a country, we are a democracy. Sri Lanka is considered Asia's oldest democracy, and we have been built, this country has been built on the democratic fundamentals, and fundamental rights of the citizens are what is granted to them by the Constitution. It is a given, and it is the people's sovereign right which is inalienable. So, I mean, you have the administration, you have the government, but can a government take away the people's rights? That's what we see that is happening. I mean, if you look at it from a governance point of view now, true enough, today there's an economic crisis that is happening in the country, but now people are coming out to the roads to protest because there are legitimate reasons, because people are oppressed. And what is the state on the other hand doing? They are silencing the people. But whereas the state on the other hand should be understanding the cause of the people and understanding why people want to protest, not silence people. Because at the end of the day, this will all result in one huge explosion of people being extremely frustrated. Today what we see is the government not addressing the hard cause and the problems of the country, but trying to palm it off on the people who are actually protesting and saying, you know, actually the reason for the downfall, or the economic downfall, is the people coming and messing up the running of the country. I mean, we saw the same thing coming onto the Aragale at one point. But why did the Aragale in this country happened? Because the administration, the way the country was managed, people were displeased. So what has happened is, I think the people who are governing the country are not understanding the rights of the people, and then also they are using the law enforcement authorities.
Lehini, are you trying to say that someone from the government ranks made that submission that you were talking about?
No, I mean, this is generally what people see as the general opinion of the public. I mean, at the end of the day, police is a law enforcement authority. Here in Sri Lanka, we see how the organizations function, whether there's independence, there are police commissions, there are police officers, but we know how influence come into play. So people actually question, Are the police acting according to the law? And if so, why are the people oppressed in this instance? Now, for example, we saw two mothers coming from Kalutara to Colombo, and they were just walking on the road holding two boards. Why do you need to kind of, suppress their freedom to walk on the road and express their dissent, because they are actually fighting for a cause? I mean, it's the same way. Now, if you really look at the present president, there was the 52-day coup that happened in this country, and people got on the road and fought for democracy at that point, and that's how the coup was turned around. And we see the same leader right now having a different approach.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Lehini Fernando, representing the SJB. Lehini, I'll just refresh your memory. It's not because of the people coming to the streets that the 52-day government had to, the decision had to be reversed, because it was because of a court decision.
But then people did have an impact. People had the freedom to come
but the judiciary has to decide independently.
Very well.
So thank you very much, Lehini, for your thoughts as well. So I'll open the floor for questions from our journalists. Let me quickly remind their names once again. Immediate right is Shania, immediate left is Ruhaza, far left is Shalan. Because she's a newcomer, let's start off with Ruhaza.
Thank you, Shamir. So I'd like to direct my question to Attorney Dr. Gihan Gunatalaga. Now, last week, we saw a few grade 5 students in a school in Millania were beaten by the teachers and then handed over to the police. Now, in this case, you can't hand over a minor to the police unless their parents are present at that very moment. And not only that, these children were taken to the police jeep and electrocuted and then brought them back to school. Now, how do parents trust schools and send children to schools? And so the people who are supposed to protect us are the police. But if the police do things like this, how are we supposed to trust them with our children?
So thanks. I think it's important that an independent investigation into this incident is launched, because we need to know independently of what a police officer or a victim says about what happens. Actually, what happens depends on a full inquiry, right? So that's the first thing I want to say. I really think that when incidents like these take place, we shouldn't leave it for us to discuss what happened. We need a really serious inquiry into what happened. And I would only add that when these kinds of incidents are reported, naturally people are reminded that the law enforcement officials in this country do not always act in good faith. They do not always act in our best interest. Police, the armed forces, by definition, they are there to protect citizens. But we find that it is not the case. And often it is political elites or powerful actors within state and outside state that enjoy the protection of law enforcement. Ordinary citizens, vulnerable communities, children, like in the example you have produced, are often left to the, left at the mercy of these institutions. And I think in that context, it is absolutely natural for there to be deep distrust between the state and citizen, and law enforcement being the institution that really reflects that distrust. So I think we can't go on like this. I referred to the ignorance of the law as a previous point. We can't go on in a situation where the police doesn't know what the law actually says. We can't go on in a situation where the citizen can't trust the very individual, the very officer that is there to protect the citizen. And I think it's not unique to Sri Lanka. We see this around the world. We've seen it in America, particularly between the African American community and law enforcement. I think it's starting to emerge as a major issue, and we are not going to have peace and stability in a country when there is such distrust.
Ihan, I'd just like to follow up. Why can't we stamp down police brutality? Is it the entrenched impunity in the system?
It is impunity, and it is because it is not a problem that emerged overnight. It is a long history of an institution enjoying complete impunity. And I think it's worth noting that we are talking about this as it happens in the South, as it has happened in our backyard. It has been happening for decades in the east and in the north, right? And where the sort of, in a crude way, those chickens have come home to roost, right? What happens in the north and east has now started to happen in the south. And I think a lot of people, a lot of victims who have gone through this, particularly during the war and its aftermath, are turning around and saying, welcome to the show, right? So this impunity, you're absolutely right, it's been a long-term problem, and I think stamping it out is also going to require a long-term solution.
Since we're talking about issues that happen within law enforcement agencies, I'd like to direct this question to Tyagi. Now, our theme this time is freedom, is our freedom under siege? I think the freedom of women especially, I think even if you take a look at the world, it has been under siege more than men for the longest time. Let's take a very recent example, this incident where two female police officers were grabbed by the neck. I mean, just looking at it visually is hard. It's extremely hard to say the very least. But I did see some reports where when statements were recorded from these female police officers who are necessarily the victims in this case, they've apparently said, but of course I'm subject to correction on this matter, they've apparently said that it's all right. We were just in the course of performing our duties and those happened. So the victims are saying that's all right. So is it all right?
I mean, everybody saw those videos. It definitely wasn't okay. It's up to a person if they feel victimized, if it made them feel uncomfortable, to go and make a complaint, right? But let's take a step back, right? How do you hold the police accountable? Usually, it's the National Police Commission who has the authority with regards to disciplinary matters with the police. And how is the National Police Commission appointed? Just like the other independent commissions, like the Human Rights Commission, like the Elections Commission, or the Bribery Commission, they're appointed by what used to be the Constitutional Council, then the Parliamentary Council, and now under the 21st Amendment, again the Constitutional Council. But the way they're appointed is now not still independent enough. I mean, the current composition of the council is to do with how they were appointed during the 20th Amendment. And that was a very politicized process. This has changed now. New commissioners haven't been appointed, but still the constitution is such that a majority of the members on the council are loyal to government. So how can you call it an independent commission when the people who are supposed to be that check and balance are partial, right? These are really the redress mechanisms we have. But if those are not effective, where are the victims supposed to go, and where would they feel comfortable?
And most often than not, in most cases, the police are investigating themselves.
And with this case, what happened, right? So I think it was the IGP who was told to look into this by the National Police Commission, who has the authority to look into it. They refer it to the IGP refer it to the police itself, and they set up a special investigation unit. So how does this work when, in Sinhala we have this saying called Horage Ammagen Pena Hanawa, which is basically you've appointed somebody to look into your own wrongs. Just doesn't work.
But now the flip side of this, how the people should respond to this, make their views known, make known to the state that this is not acceptable. I'd like to pose this question to Migara. This is actually a question that came into us from one of our viewers. So protests is one way that you show your dissent and show that these kind of things don't fly. But the question from this particular individual in the public who is currently watching our show is that all these protests are affecting the normal people's life and making them starve, and it's crippling the system, preventing the normal routing to go on. Don't you think it's a human rights violation for the normal people where some factions are gaining political advantage by protesting? How do you respond?
Well, I think initially what we should understand is, in terms of our constitution, we have a fundamental rights chapter which ensures each and every citizen the right of freedom of expression and also the freedom of peaceful assembly. So, to protest or to express their political opinions is one of their fundamental rights. Regarding the economic condition of the country and as to whether protests have an adverse impact on the economy, we should see, for example, some time back, when the government of Sri Lanka was negotiating with the IMF gave certain guidelines for the government of Sri Lanka. One of such was the respect for the rule of law. So if we are in such a dire need for IMF bailout package, I think one of the first things we should do is we should guarantee the rule of law and the fundamental freedoms of the people, which includes the right to protest. So people come to the roads to protests. Most of the protests that we saw the following weeks or the weeks before were peaceful protests. And how was the public disrupted in this process was, we had hundreds and thousands of policemen on the streets who closed down the roads for no reason. I remember one incident in the Golface Green where there were around 20 to 30 or 40 people maximum peacefully protesting on the pavement of Golface, and the police closed down the road. So the question we have to ask again, who disrupts the ordinary public routine in this country? People have a right to protest, but the extent, or is it proportionate, the amount of officers and the resources that the police use against these protests?
Megara, prior to 2009, we saw individuals had to take their national identity cards and walk about because there was a state of emergency in the country, and it was acceptable at that time to have such a regulation put in place. In 2019, when the April 21st attacks took place, even then, there was no such regulation that was brought forward by the police department with regard to individuals carrying their national identity cards. Now we're talking about a nation that is devoid of terrorism. We're talking about a nation that is boasting of freedom of expression, so on and so forth. However, after the incident that Raz was referring to was reported several days ago, the police comes up with this new plan saying that individuals who are going on the road must carry their national identity cards. Absurd, isn't it?
I think I would have to agree with you on that, because if we look at the police do have some sort of a discretion to maintain public peace and order. But the question, or rather the issue we face right now, is how the police use this discretion. Can they just drag a person on the simple fact of suspicion?
Or it could be pressure from high officials. Probably because of that, they might be doing something like this.
I know. So it also once again boils down to the issue how they use their discretion.
But at the end of the day, shouldn't a person be able to identify themselves? Or confirm their identity?
Correct, Charlie. I will answer that. So in this particular incident where a person was taken to the police station for not having his identity card, was taken to the police station and kept there for hours. The police surely can contact their next of kin, their family, and get down his identity card. In fact, his family members had come to the police station. Still, he was kept
I believe his employer.
Yes, his employer came to the police station and gave his identification, but still he was kept in police custody. So my issue is the police have a discretion, no doubt about that. On the basis of suspicion or for any other reason to maintain public order and peace, police can use their powers. But the issue is whether they use this discretion properly. Now, another example. We see people protesting for their rights. Have you seen the number of water cannons, number of officers that the police brings to the road? These are public resources. Is it proportionate? So if the police are using these resources and public property at their whims and fancies or to please whoever that they want to please, is it not corruption?
Yeah,
is it not corruption?
Yeah, but Megara, as you said, if it was a situation where there was a state of emergency in the country, it's understood. But subsequent an incident of this sort happening and then the police making a statement of this nature goes on to show how the legal system in Sri Lanka has failed, isn't it?
I think it's more to do with the law enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
I think the police and the military have a discretion to exercise their powers and authority. So time and again they have failed us.
Right.
They have failed us.
So interestingly, Lehini, you spoke about the 50-day government. You spoke about how important it is to ensure freedom of expression, so on and so forth, freedom of democracy, all that and more. So I'm going to be the devil's advocate now. Unfortunately, we don't have a government representative here. How can peaceful protesters set fire to dozens of MPs within 3 days? After the Temple Trees attack on Golface, protesters took place.
So, by no means do we justify any of those acts. Just because people have the freedom to protest, it should not, we don't justify that kind of attack. So I mean, whether those things are happening under different political whims or fancies, it's up to them. It is. That's what we need to assess. And there are also law enforcement authorities who needs to investigate on how all these things transpired. By no means do people justify, but then people's right to protest should not be, you know.
Are you saying the police have failed?
See, law enforcement authorities, I believe, can act in a much more responsible manner in terms of investigating into these things. Even to this date, what we see in this country is blame game passing, but we don't see people who are actually responsible, the law, I mean, being brought to book, cases being filed. I mean, simple examples, like you take all these scams that have happened. To this date, have the investigations happened? Have the cases been filed? It goes to all that.
But Lehini, look at the way several weeks ago, how one of your former MPs, who's a female, acted in front of the police.
See,
is that acceptable?
See,
right, there's two sides to the coin, right? Now we are talking about women's rights and all that and more, but on certain occasions, when SJB members act like that,
see,
what's the example they set?
So I disagree with you on that, because I mean she has been one of the foremost people.
Like
No, wait, she's been one of the foremost people who came to protest, and one of the people who actually, you know,
there's no question about it, but acting like that, is that justifiable?
No, that is just, you know, I mean there were women who were harassed, who was with her was harassed, so it's her way of protesting. I mean, that is not a main thing for you to judge and say, you know, tag a label on her, but it's just that why did she do that? What led her to do that? Because here in Sri Lanka, what we always see is we have the blame game going in, but we don't see what actually triggered that. So I think, you know, there was a legitimate reason for her to act. I mean, they were peacefully protesting. They wanted to go and you had 200 or 300 police people with, as he said, water barricades blocking the way. It was a very peaceful protest. And also you saw police people manhandling women. But can that happen? I mean, when we see how you know, protesters very peacefully who come, but the police get involved and disrupt the whole thing.
But don't you think even the protesters have a responsibility to play when they engage in protest in the country?
I think protesters so far, I mean, you saw the Aragalaya going on for several decades. Were the people in the Aragalaya irresponsible? Were the protesters
several months.
Yeah, so but were they irresponsible? It was actually discussed as one of the thought-provoking places where there are things like policy and many different things of like how system change in this country. All of that things were discussed.
Since you brought that up,
Charlotte, with your permission, can I get Shania to pose some of the questions that are posed by our viewers who are watching the show tonight?
Sure, Shamil. Just before that, I have a question for you, Lehini. So last year, the first female DIG was appointed. I believe her name is Bimshani Araji. She was demoted on the grounds that women cannot reach that position, and now it's being petitioned against. Is this a flaw in the legislation, or is it just the misogyny entrenched in the system?
I think, you know, here we see women in decision-making roles. When they go up the higher in the hierarchy, there is always this whole thing, you know, can a woman hold that position? So the whole stigma, you know, women were never there. So that whole thing happens. I mean, even if you take in parliament, we don't see the enough representation there. So same thing where you see the police over the years, it has always been male dominant. So can a woman come? There is always question. But I think, you know, it is extremely unfair. We don't have a system in this country where things are weighed on merit. I mean, if she has the qualifications, if she has the capability, and if she's the right person, why can't she even be the IGP of this country?
And what was their case that the legislation doesn't include the word woman? Was that the case?
Yeah, so there was this, the regulation didn't have the word woman, and then that was the foremost point that was being brought up, but that I think it was the how it is defined, but that is a very trivial ground for argument. But the fact of the matter is that the whole adverse thoughts that people have when women go into higher positions, which is wrong. I think, you know, in this country we see female representation being at a very low level in all levels. So I think even 52% of the population are women, and are women given the right place in the position, and women have to fight for it. So which is unfortunate. And even we see the budget these days, it's not a gender sensitive budget. I mean, we can go on and on. So it is, how do you address society's problems?
Everyone has a responsibility and a role to play, Balini. There is no question about that. Migara, interestingly, in your opening remarks, you say repressive state mechanism is the order of the day at this moment of time. Haven't we seen such a development before as well? Is it the first time that we're witnessing this? Because if you look at the 1990 era of the Batalanda issues that took place, we spoke about all this, and even at that time it was the current head of state who was the political authority who was handling that particular prison camp in question. What are your thoughts?
Yes, allegedly in 1980s the present president is rumored to have engaged in repressive state practices, and that repression quite unfortunately has returned to the present day as well. So I think one of the issues of repression that we see in the present day is use of law to suppress dissent, and also the use of state agencies, officers and law enforcement authorities to suppress the rights of the people who are engaging in peaceful protests and expression of their political dissent. So I think it's quite a serious situation. As you said, our country in different phases of history has experienced repression, and unfortunately right now also we are facing a situation where our freedoms are under siege. So I think the PTA is one example where a law that was designed to curb terrorism and terrorist activities is unfortunately used against people exercising their democratic rights. So I think it's a very dismal and disappointing situation where we as citizens have to face today.
Sorry, so, Dr. Gehan, now you spoke about the independent investigation that should be carried out related to the children, right? Now, since these commissions are being appointed by the people itself who are committing all these crimes, do you think there will be a positive outcome, or what do you think we should do about it for a positive outcome?
That's a really important question, and I don't envy anyone who's on these investigative bodies. But at the same time, all these mechanisms with their flaws contribute towards us discovering the truth, right? We've had a whole history of commissions that have fallen short of expectations in terms of delivering truth and accountability. But it's always revealed little bits and pieces that change the narrative, right? I mean, good example is the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. Everyone was very skeptical when it was first established, and rightly so, because it was established by the government at the time with the agenda to whitewash what had taken place. But then it produced a report, and everyone was a little surprised by the report. It wasn't, that bad. It was actually quite good. And then it did create a momentum for a justice project that eventuated in some very serious commitments. So similarly, you have the Easter Sunday Commission report, right? Again, the agenda was very much to, sweep everything under the carpet. But that didn't quite happen. That same commission report was taken by groups that were involved in advocacy, victims groups, and they started demanding justice by actually quoting the commission report. So,
but nothing concrete has taken place.
That may be so.
Right now.
That may be so. But if you go and speak to people about mindset,
talk about the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission report, Gyan. Who is talking about this? One of the allegations leveled in this particular report in question was that then Vice President of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party should be held accountable. Karun Amman should be held accountable to the crimes committed in the eastern province of the country, where Muslims.
I'll tell you what the benefit is. This conversation we're having.
Nothing.
You think we can have this conversation without the opening of doors to very controversial matters? We can't. Right? We can't have this conversation without an actual opening of a door. And I think as flawed as all these processes are, we have to work with whatever is given. So that's why I'm saying independent investigations, they're not totally independent. Obviously there's going to be a flawed mechanism, and there's going to be an attempt to whitewash or attempt to sweep things under the carpet. But truth has a funny way of showing itself when this happens.
Now we see a lot of communiques being published in light of what is happening right now. I saw a lot of tweets that are made by your organization as well over the recent past with regard to what took place subsequent to the Aragalaya and what unfolded therein. So the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka says that the Sri Lankan police are violating people's human rights constantly and continuously. But my question is not about this statement. Does the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka have the teeth to take action against those who are engaged in such malpractices?
I mean, I don't speak behalf of the
No,
Human
I know,
Rights
but yeah,
Commission.
but I know, but in terms of your knowledge across the world.
So it depends on the powers given to it. So the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka is governed by the Human Rights Commission Act. They have the power to take complaints, they have the power to make inquiries, they have the power to make recommendations, but what they also lack is power of enforcement. Like we've seen just recently, there was a court order given against an officer for the police officer, Sugat Mendes, who was also arrested along with the former CID director, Shani Abesekara. And he was told that, I can't remember the details of the case, but basically that he should be paid arrears of his salary for so many months and he should be reinstated. But the police didn't enforce this. So this is a court order that has been given to the police saying reinstate the officer and pay his salary in arrears. But until today, I think when the IGP today, I saw a news item saying that he's apologized and they've decided to pay these arrears. But this is a court saying it, right? They have a different set of powers to a commission.
But Tyagi, the problem is the HRCSL summons police officers. They issue communiques. They go to the extent of reprimanding certain officers attached to the political authority as well. However, no action has been taken internationally and locally. Can someone take concrete action against these law enforcement authorities who violate the fundamental rights of the people of Sri Lanka?
Tyagi, I just have a follow-up question regarding that. So over 1,200 complaints, right, made against law enforcement. What has been the response?
So we've seen, right, huge public outcry because they've seen something on social media or the news and they're like, how is this still happening? Human Rights Commission is on par with other independent commissions like the Police Commission. Police Commission has the authority to take action, actually take action, because Human Rights Commission doesn't have this power because they are not dealing with the police, but the Police Commission does. So what is the Police Commission doing right now? We keep having the same conversation every year. Last year, I remember there was a huge public uproar because everybody saw how a poor man who went on the street in Valigama in search of food during a lockdown. Policemen beat him down, he fell on the road and a bus ran him over and killed him. And there was huge public uproar. And then what happens? Right? In these investigations, what actually comes out at the end? We've seen them being reprimanded, they'll be, transferred, which is actually quite funny because are they transferred to go and do the same thing they did somewhere else?
But Tyagi, again, now this brings to, this sheds light on the flawed systems here in the country. And I'd like to pose this question to Gehan. Now, we keep on saying, the police is not doing anything, the IGP is just passing the ball, just reprimanding people, transferring them. But recently, I believe, a few months behind, or maybe even a few years, or a year ago maybe, the IGP made a statement, I believe a few months ago, the IGP made a statement saying that the OICs of police stations across the country, I believe there are about 183 OICs to be appointed, out of which he has had a say in appointing 3. And about 180 have been political appointments, some of whom hadn't even shown up for the interview. So can you really say these officers are accountable or should be accountable when this is the kind of political intervention that they have to deal with?
I mean, he's revealed one of the serious problems in terms of law enforcement, right? I don't know whether what he said is true or false, but let's assume it's true.
He made this by way of a statement.
Let's assume it's true. It's not a surprising fact, is it? When you think about the entire public service, the entire state apparatus.
But it should be.
No,
it
it's
should
not,
be.
It's not surprising,
but it
ought
should
to
be alarming.
Yeah, it ought to be alarming, but we're exposed enough to what's going on in Sri Lanka to know that this is not surprising, right? So if the state apparatus is politicized, if law enforcement is politicized, I mean, how much can you expect in terms of people's freedom? So it goes back to the point I made at the outset. We are operating with the wrong fundamentals. We're operating as if we have to prove to the state that we ought to be allowed to do what we should be allowed to do anyway as citizens. Even the point on the NIC, why should I have to carry my NIC? I'm not a suspect. I'm not. Why should I have to prove my identity to anyone?
You just spoke about the fundamentals that they operate on.
Yeah.
So the police ordinance was implemented in 1895. Why haven't these laws been amended?
I mean, they should be updated for sure, but let's leave aside the question of they should be updated. The fact of the matter is, the law is in plain, English. It's translated into the other languages. It's easy to read enough. I mean, it's easy enough to read and comprehend the fact that the law might say something very specific. Now, the police ordinance is very specific about the need to give prior notice before a protest. Now, how can someone take that word and turn it on its head and then insist on prior approval, right? And there are judgments if we want to, if you think of the word having different interpretations, there are judgments. There's a very famous judgment by the Supreme Court that's clarified that you do not need to get prior approval. So, leaving aside the fact that these laws are archaic, I mean, let's not forget that we used the quarantine ordinance from the 1800s to deal with a modern pandemic. And despite the fact that many of us raised the question, why aren't we passing a new law on public health emergency? It wasn't done. We used the quarantine ordinance, right? So we have a habit of, using outdated laws for really important things and then rushing through new laws like the Port City law when we really want to do something, right? So that issue is certainly acknowledged. But leaving aside that issue, even the plain language of a law is not applied. And I think that's a serious problem. And it reveals the extent of what you raised, Sheldon, the politicization of these institutions. The reason that they don't apply the law as it ought to be applied is because they are constantly being told what to do from political actors higher up, constant. So obviously you would want 90% of OICs to be political appointees because you're instrumentalizing that position in order for political gain.
This discussion has gone around like a little bit of a hole in the bucket because now when you say all of these things happening, and the only way that the people can really stand up against that is again by protesting. By protest, yes.
Exactly.
And it's back to the question that was raised by our viewers saying when these protests take place, it inconveniences the general public. But then there is a little bit of an amendment here because you brought up the point that now the protests that are being held these days, during the past few months, were peaceful protesters, and it's the police that comes in the hundreds and the thousands and close down the roads. I've always had this question. We speak about freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Does the police really have such an authority to close down a road as and when they see fit?
Certainly not. Certainly not. In terms of the National Thoroughfares Act, the police cannot do that. And in fact, the people have a fundamental right which the government of Sri Lanka have accepted in terms of many international conventions. So the people have a right to express, go have peaceful assemblies and even march on the roads because...
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that the police can't go in hundreds and thousands and...
Certainly.
Be on the road.
As I said earlier, if the police use their resources disproportionately and use them on peaceful protesters exercising their democratic rights, the purpose of using those resources, if we see, benefits a particular category of people in society, the political elites. That would amount to corruption. But because these are public resources that they're using to benefit a particular class of people.
With regard to the closure of roads and restriction of people's right to movement, now this was seen a lot during COVID-19 especially, but this has again, like Gehan said, become the norm. The restriction has become the norm. So, for example, if a citizen is driving in a car along the road and the police stop you and say, "Yanda be para wahala," the citizen would just turn around. But should that be the case?
So that depends on the context. There might be a legitimate reason to close the road.
Right.
So we
more
often
than
comply.
not, more often than not.
No. So we often comply out of a sense of.
But is the citizen entitled to ask why? What is happening?
The citizen is entitled to ask his employee, the policeman. We employ the policeman. We pay for the policeman to have his job, right? They work for us. We sometimes forget that.
Now we pay a bit extra also.
Well, soon we'll be paying extra. But I think just to complete the point, there have been attempts to even make this legitimate by having things like high security zones across Colombo. There were attempts, and then
under the Public Secrets Act.
Under the Official Secrets Act,
but they reversed it.
They reversed it because there was a backlash. There was opposition because, of course, it was completely flawed to do this under the Official Secrets Act. But they could pass.
That was the first U-turn that President Ranil Wickremesinghe took.
And I hope not the last. The point is...
You hope it is the last?
Not the last U-turn.
Oh, not the last U-turn. Okay.
So Migar, Liheni, interestingly, in 2010, 10th of August, Mervyn Silva, who was a very famous minister at that time, still very infamous to be very honest, he was the Deputy Minister of Highways at that time. He tied up an official, Samurdhi official, after accusing him of not attending meetings to discuss a dengue fever outbreak. And then several days later, this same Samurdhi officer went on media and said he did that willingly and they were staging all this. Now, getting back to one of the guests earlier, with regard to the two police female officers saying that this is part and parcel of the job. So you hear these things. Is it because of duress they say all this? So what is the reason behind this? Can't they stand on their feet? And if that is the case, what must civil society do?
So this is the problem.
What is the problem? What is the problem?
Problem is the power a politician in this country has. So the politician probably exercises more power on that on
You're
the
a politician as well, Lean. So
but it doesn't mean I approve everything that all the politicians do.
But you have the power.
So, but the thing is this, here in Sri Lanka, the politicians are kept at a pedestal.
You're not answering that question.
Let me answer the first question.
Why aren't you answering that question? No, I want to know, why aren't you answering that question?
So the politicians in this country...
Do you wish you had the power as well?
But you should have the power. When you have the power, you must do the right thing. What our politicians do is when they have the power, they use it for the wrong reasons. I mean, politicians in this country are kept on a pedestal.
Across the board. Yes. Whether it's SJB, whether it's NPP, whether it's SLPP.
Get called up for this statement.
See, it's like this.
See, this is how you're being careful. Don't do that.
No, politicians. I mean, I'm not trying to say every politician is. I mean,
you said across the board at one point. And when I say SJB, then you're silent.
No, there are good politicians. There are obviously politicians who are flawed as well. Doesn't mean when people say you need to throw 225, you don't. It's a word you use, but then within the 225, there are good people as well. But the problem is, Shamir.
But right now, people have got fed up. But they want to throw all 225.
Again, it comes to the politician. What about the government servant? Now, in this instance which you spoke of, you keep the politician on the pedestal. Why can't the government official? Why do you have to comply to everything that the politician says? Why aren't the government officials who are also being paid by the taxpayer, who should be loyal to the taxpayer?
Remember the past. Can't you remember right after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa took over office, went on that Samanga Pilisadarak meeting and said, circular? What is a circular? My word is a circular.
So, yeah, exactly.
So when you have political authority right at the helm of government, making statements of that nature, and you are pointing the finger at the government.
No, so it's like
which is very unfair.
This is how the system has been developed from right throughout, which people say we need a system change. So you have the 1.5 million government officials in this country. If those 1.5 government officials worked in line with the law, if their loyalty was towards the taxpayer and not towards the politician, the system today would be far different.
I just wish, Leni, you were not a politician talking here on the show.
You talk that
you were independently talking about what's going on in the country.
It's the truth.
Tyagi, I just have a question for you. So, youth journalist Tarindu Jayawardena, basically he was interrogated for 6 hours by the CID, and he's popularly known for reporting opposition to the government. On what grounds has this arrest and interrogation happened? 6 hours of CID interrogation.
So as far as I know, so he's the president of the Young Journalists Association, and he had gone to the CID to find out the name of certain police officers who were involved in some acts of brutality. And for that, he was sort of kept in custody and interrogated. So it's reprisals, isn't it? It's basically, if you question me, I will harass you. So it's that power, and that there is no check on that power, which is absurd. I would also want to just take this opportunity to add something regarding the protests and closing roads and things like that. I think we have a very narrow way of looking at public spaces. Public spaces, as long as they're not, if it's a private space, a different set of rules apply completely. But public spaces aren't just for, say, for example, a road. You can't look at it in terms of something that's just built for vehicular movement. It's a public property where you can use that space for other purposes as well. Of course, it's going to inconvenience some people. That is the nature of a protest. But those are allowed under international law. People should have a more broader view. This inconvenience for some is actually people's right to protest.
It's civil disobedience, right?
Not even there. I think this is even below that. This is actually exercising their right to peaceful assembly. There is no right to,
Civil disobedience.
I'm talking about there is no right to acts of violence and things like that. The human right is to peaceful assembly. So as long as a protest is, for example, fairly peaceful, or if there are, one or two people committing acts of violence, when there's like 100 people, you can't shut down the whole protest. Then you have to deal with those one or two elements, and you can't preemptively block roads. And one other thing, just because you
previously.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't help myself. But yeah, you were asking Lihini about the former parliamentarian and about her behavior. Would we ask the same of a male politician? For example, we've seen in the parliament itself, people throwing chili powder, water, but yet when it comes to a woman, we speak about, is she using cuss words? What is she wearing? Why is she speaking that way? Why did she go and hug a police officer? This scrutiny is because of her gender, and we have to realize that.
What is
Again,
the role
our
of the-
serious question is now everything that we spoke about. The main topic that I feel the question that comes out is, does the police know the law? Doesn't seem like they know the law thoroughly.
I would suspect that there is definitely a gap
Have we-
in understanding, right? And there are several examples of where the specificity of a law is not quite known. So there is ignorance for sure. But my suspicion is it doesn't end there. I think the problem is much more to do with politicization. It's where someone is told to do something and what the law says becomes irrelevant, right? And I think it's a combination of ignorance and politicization that produces this problem.
So there is no way for these people to speak up.
Which people?
The policemen.
Well, when the whole system is politicized, then obviously there'll be reprisals within the system if you speak up. Now, there are some protections in the law in terms of whistleblowers. But again, you're asking someone to really take a massive risk by doing that, and that's not always realistic. So I think the combination of politicization and ignorance is why we really have
But
this
we spoke a lot about protests and right to peaceful assembly and how protesters can't get violent. Migara, you were a part of the Aragalaya, you quite very involved in it. I don't hear too much about the attack that was launched on the Aragalaya on the 9th of May. Because despite the fact that it triggered all the subsequent violent attacks, besides that point completely, the simple fact that the Aragalaya was attacked in the way that it was, and there are statements by supporters of the political party that came and attacked, saying that we cleaned up this one and we're going to hit that one. What's the progress of those cases? Because the last time I checked, the case was filed by way of a private plaint. By a lawyer and not the police itself. So what's the progress? Do you have any?
I think there were several cases which are still ongoing. As you said, on the 9th of May, there was a rally held in Temple Trees, where several politicians of the government party participated in that. And there were incidents where certain parliamentarians provoked their audience to go and attack the protesters in Golface. I think this is the triggering point which started all this violence, which followed in an attack towards Golface, and the rest, of course, was beyond the control of anyone. And all across the country we saw incidents of violence which the police or the law enforcement authorities could not control. So I think there were several cases filed initially regarding the politicians who participated in that particular meeting in Temple Trees, and the people who participated in the attack on Golface protesters also. But whilst that was going on, after May 9, several or many cases were filed on people allegedly for attacking public property and houses of parliamentarians and also causing harm to private property. So I think there is an overwhelming number of cases now being filed against people, ordinary people, for alleged acts of violence on the May 9th, apart from the initial cases that were filed against the government party supporters.
Gehan?
Yeah, I just have a question for you. Historically, police brutality in the West has stemmed from racism, and we saw this with the murder of George Floyd back in 2020 in the US. But what is it here? Is it the consequence of a top-down corrupt system, or is it too much power concentrated in law enforcement?
I think it's a bit of what we spoke about earlier, no? The politicization of the entire force, the lack of checks and balances, and the ability to get away with murder, as it were. We hear about custodial deaths, we hear about torture, we've seen videos of, like Nigara said, just violence happening in broad daylight. I think it's a combination of all those things, and that's essentially what Aragale spoke about, no? They wanted system change. The youth of this country had just had enough, and they're now connected to the world like people were never before.
And do you feel like that's an idealistic ask, system change?
I mean, I guess people have to start somewhere, no? It's the advent of social media in a way.
I mean, I think about 100 years ago, having women in parliament was an idealistic thought, and now it's a reality, but
I think it's reality of life.
But let's not forget Sri Lanka produced the first female prime minister in the world.
Yeah, but then even to this date, how many numbers do we have? Why even to this date now they're going to cut, let's go to local government. 8,000, they're going to cut down to 4,000. Then the 25% quota that was introduced, is it going to be there? So and then they want to bring into, there's lobbying to bring in the 25% to parliament, but then there's hush, there's nobody who wants to actually champion it. Why? Because 52% of the population are women. Shouldn't women be there in decision making? These quotas do not need to be there for lifetime, but initially to get the numbers up. I think if women are in governance, I think most of these issues, I mean, maybe you might say I'm being biased, but the way the things are approached, a holistic approach that a woman can bring to the table will actually add value.
And it's 25% just in the nominations.
Nominations.
And that's also in local government, central government, provincial council government, none of that.
Parliament is 5.3%.
Again, just following up on the question that Ruhaza posed to you, saying that what if the police officer in question does not know the law? But there is a regulation in the law provisions or the constitution that clearly articulates that every citizen should know the law of the land. Am I correct on that?
As I said before, there's a maxim, and it's well accepted that ignorance of the law is no excuse, which means you are supposed to know the law, right? So
police officers are no exception to it.
I would go a step further and say, if you're a state official and if you're a law enforcement official, I mean, they're enforcing the law after all, right? Surely ignorance can't be an excuse, and we constantly come across situations in which the law is, almost made up. It's imagined. Now, a good example is recent police curfews. There's no concept of police curfew on our statute books. There's an emergency, there's a sort of regime for emergency law, and there are provisions in the Public Security Ordinance to impose curfew in particular places, but that has to be done by gazette. This idea of police going out and declaring curfew is not found in the law, but it happens so often that even the lawyers sometimes are scratching their heads to find out whether there is actually a provision, because it's happening with such impunity. There must be some provision somewhere.
Mika, you want to add anything to that? Police officers knowing the law of the land?
I think now when we look at the constitution, the power of the government derives from the people. So politicians initially serve at the pleasure of the people, but I think they have taken it for granted. For example, coming back to the conversation we've been having here regarding public officials like police officers, a point was raised where it was said by the IGP himself, exposing their own follies, that 182 odd OICs are politicized. So a political culture is structured in such a way that the public officials think that they are serving at the pleasure of the politicians. That is a wrong conception. That is a misconception entirely. Actually, public officers, politicians serve at the pleasure of the people. I think that is why the people rose to their feet and came out in large numbers to protest, to remind them, the officials and the political elite, that actually they serve at the pleasure of the people. I think that was the underlying message that we need to take from the movement in Galface and the Aragalaya, which also continues right now. People are making their voice loud and clear, and their message is that.
Tyagi, what is the role of the civil society now? Individuals in the caliber of Vasant Mutlige is now in remand custody. It's over 90 days, so almost 90 days. So what's the role of the civil society? What's the role of organizations such as Amnesty International in a situation like this in a country?
So actually it's over 90 days now. He was arrested on the 18th of August, and then a backdated detention order was produced with the date saying it's the 21st. So from the 21st, under the PTA, you can hold them for 90 days. But the problem with the PTA is that you can keep renewing that 90-day detention order for up to a year. It used to be 18 months, now it's down to 1 year, but still this is very arbitrary. And it's only, I think just today or yesterday, that he was produced before a court for the first time since he was arrested. Can you imagine what kind of abuse he could have gone through in custody, especially if the state was sort of going after him as a form of reprisals for him standing up against the state's repression? So this is really the problem with the PTA, which is why now there is such a public movement against the PTA, like we've never seen before. So civil society, who's been talking about the PTA for a very long time, now feels validated and vindicated for what they've been saying. Civil society, we saw over the past few days, they've been going and protesting in front of embassies, in front of the UN, trying to pressure those who they think have some kind of say, some kind of power to tell the government not to renew their detention orders, because on the 18th, this set of detention orders expires. And we're already hearing that it might be renewed once more. So in case we lose the GSP Plus concessions based on the fact that the government is still using the PTA, I mean, the commitment was that they will repeal or reform the PTA and there would be a moratorium. But here, forget the moratorium, now you're using this against protesters. Is the government going to be responsible?
These are used against protesters, quite rightly, as you said. But Gehan, just a question for you. Now, when a protest is taking place, as a civilian, what are your rights when you are confronted by law enforcement officials and if you are not part of the protest? Because we've seen this happen. People who are not part of the protest just walking on the side, law enforcement comes and says, hey, get in, we're taking you in, we're arresting you. So during a situation like that, what are the rights of citizens if they are in the vicinity of a protest but not really part of the protest and they're confronted by law enforcement officials?
So it first depends on whether this is a peaceful protest or a violent protest, right? Because the law approaches and deals with peaceful protests differently to a protest that is considered to be unlawful and violent, right? So if you're walking on the street next to a peaceful protest, the first question is, why are people being arrested in the first place, right? Regardless of whether you're participating in the protest or not, you should not be arrested. Even if you are participating, you should not be arrested because you have a right to peaceful protest. Peaceful assembly is a fundamental right in this country. We forget that sometimes.
Okay, on that presumption, Gehan, let's say you're part of the peaceful protest. You are a part of the protest. You are a civilian. let's assume it's a peaceful protest. What are the rights of the citizens when they are protesting and confronted by law enforcement officials and told, you know, you're part of a non-peaceful, a violent protest, you need to stop, you need to disperse? What are their rights if they're standing there and they're protesting?
So every single right you have has a corresponding duty. That's the way rights work. Okay, so the question is, if I have a right to protest, who has a duty? It's the state. The state has a duty not to arrest me. The state has a duty to actually tolerate my protest, provided it's peaceful. Once it becomes violent, then there are some provisions in the law that permit the state to take certain action. Again, proportionality is a very important principle.
But Gehan,
right?
these are very, very conceptual matters,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
things on paper,
Yes,
law,
of course,
all of
but they
that.
are
But
important.
I'm asking you very
Yeah.
practically,
Yeah,
so
okay.
that, you know, the people who are watching this right now can take away something. You are in a protest. It's a peaceful protest, let's presume. The police come, they say this is a violent protest, disperse or we are going to arrest you. What can the people really say to the police officer? What can he say?
Look, if you're asking for practical advice on how to survive that situation, I would say do what you need to do to not get beaten up, obviously, right? So that
we're at that stage now.
So if that's the advice you're asking me, what's the situation? You're in a peaceful protest.
What
but
would
the
you do,
police-
Gehan? What
No,
would you do?
If the police is bound to act outside the law, and you can see that.
Not bound to act, you mean is allowed to act?
No, but I mean, you can, if you see this transpire and you're in a peaceful protest and now the police come with batons and they're going to start attacking peaceful protesters, it's not something that doesn't happen. No, it happens. No, I would say you need to take care of yourself.
So that
right?
means
going to cite the constitution for an ordinary protest.
so what
right?
can the citizen do now? Let's say the police use force.
So this is why I think sometimes
Brutality.
you have
Then what happened?
You have lawyers attend peaceful protests and show visibly and in terms of the optics be present there in order to create some kind of buffer sometimes, because then lawyers can make the point that I'm making. So sometimes you see that happening, and it happened in Golface as well. Right? You sometimes go there in attire to demonstrate that there are people there who know the law, and then the police is a little bit cautious about violating it. But there is no guarantee.
Because we're talking about
yeah.
the protester, but does the police also have a right?
To do
Police
what?
have a right to do what?
Police have a right to ensure that their safety is well looked after in terms of a protest that goes violent.
Yeah, I think certainly police have an overwhelming duty to maintain peace and order for the public, and that also entails ensuring that their own officers are not in harm's way. But the issue we see is, as Gehan said, in certain instances during the past few months, lawyers also came in large numbers to the site at Golface and to many other protests to demonstrate to the police that these are people who know the law and not to transgress the law. But unfortunately, on the 22nd of July, there were incidents where lawyers themselves were assaulted. So I think in such situations, we all confront a situation where our rights could be endangered when we are participating in a protest. So what are our remedies is the question. Our remedies are, in terms of the Constitution, we have fundamental rights. If a police officer attacks us, assaults us during a protest, a peaceful protest, as Gehan said, we have a right to institute fundamental rights applications against them. And there have been many decent advise people to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know under what conditions he made that statement. But what I am saying is people have recourse to the law. And if you are looking at police brutality, it's happening everywhere. Now, when you look at the instances of Vasantha Mudalige and Galwawa Siridhamma suffered from dengue and he was brought to the hospital after a couple of days. While he was being detained, they didn't treat him. And after being brought to the hospital, they kept him for 2 days and took him back to the cell. And Vasantha Mudalige is suffering from skin disease. So this is entirely police brutality. So people have a right. One right would be to file fundamental rights applications. Courts have time and again held against the police and sided with the people, ensuring their fundamental rights. Second action available to the people would be to file private actions against the police officers in the magistrates court, and also damages if their rights are infringed by the police.
And in
I think
situations
there
like-
should be a check and balance by the people themselves against these officers.
And in a situation like that, the police officer who has been subject to that FR petition or whatever it is cannot even be promoted under the law, right, Mikara?
That is the usual practice. That is the usual practice, but I do not know whether it has been always conformed to.
Right.
I think Tyagi wanted to say something. She's been dying for quite a while. She's seated right next to me, so I can see her. It's very uncomfortable. Tyagi, go ahead.
So sorry. No, I think you are also asking, and I might have misunderstood you, but the rights of the people at the point of arrest, right? Internationally, you need to be told the reason for your arrest.
We don't have the Miranda statement, or what is it called? What's there in the US? We don't have that, do we?
Well, usually you have to be told why you're being arrested. Ideally, you have a warrant as well. There are instances where you don't have a warrant because the alleged crime takes place then and there. Of course, then the police wouldn't have a warrant. You have to be informed where you're going to be taken to. And we've seen during Aragale, there were protesters who were essentially abducted because they went missing for a couple of hours. Human Rights Commission went from police station to police station trying to figure out where they were taken. And this is happening in a country which has enforced disappearances as a huge issue, right, throughout the decades. And then you also need to have access to your family, to a lawyer. So those are usual rights at the point of being arrested. So that's what we say when the police, pulls out a protester out of a bus and say, and also in plain clothes, not even in uniform, and then being dragged away, disappears for a few hours. That's not following due process of the law. And that's a huge problem.
What is the way forward, Tyagi? Now we're talking about this subject, we're saying the matter has to be arrested immediately. If that is the case, what is the way forward? What is the solution that we have for a problem like this that is plaguing our nation at this very moment of time?
Accountability. That's very simple, I think. Like, that's the overarching issue with most of these problems we've been talking about.
Gahan, in your opinion, what is the way forward? I'll pose this question to all four so I get a neutral view of independent view as to what you all think about. So Tyagi speaks about accountability is the way forward. In your opinion, what is it, Gahan?
So I would say that there are certain things that we need to safeguard, right? So I'm not saying that that's going to be the solution, but I can see the situation getting much worse if we don't safeguard certain things. And that is the freedom to have these conversations, right? So I think media freedom, and particularly freedom to converse freely on social media, is under grave threat. Because there's a history here, and the state has recognized that despite the incredible media machine that the previous president had, incredible, the most sophisticated, I mean, no offense to Sirasa, but it was a really impressive propaganda machine, right? And it did produce a leader that a lot of people thought is going to deliver, a technocratic, disciplined, highly efficient government, and then we discovered what the truth is going to be, right? But how did we displace that leadership? It is through dissent, and dissent through unregulated social media space and media freedom that enable that conversation to take place and galvanize into a mass protest movement. Now we need to be careful to ensure that is not lost, because that is really seriously a threat. And today we are discussing things like online safety bills, cyber security laws. They come with different all kinds of titles, but they're all trying to do the same thing, and that is trying to control the medium. And if we lose the medium, forget about the solution, because we have no way of even discussing solutions if we lose the medium. Today we have this ability to have the conversation because there's a semblance of media freedom in the country, and it is at risk of being lost.
Way forward, interesting question. I think after 3 years since November 16, 2019, right now the people are disillusioned. So it essentially means that we have a parliament and a president without a mandate. So the way forward, the first thing would be the people need to speak. People's voices, people's franchise needs to come out. That is number one. Second thing is, what if we appoint a new parliament, new president, and they also go haywire? What are we going to do then? Then the solution is, as Tyagi said, accountability. But what is the mechanism of accountability that we are going to have? In some Western democracies, there's a system called recall, where if your representative is not acting as they promised or according to your mandate, you can call them back. I think we need a system of accountability. One proposal that came out from the Golfest protest are the people's councils, where the people can gather and discuss the policies of the government and impose a check and balance on the government when they are not implementing the will of the people. So I think one solution, number one, would be the people need to speak up, their franchise needs to be heard. Secondly, there should be a mechanism of accountability, some sort of a forum where the people's voices are heard, where they can actually recall representatives, maybe parliamentarians, provincial councils, or even the president, if they don't honor the mandate they got.
Migara, all this sounds well and good. It looks like a good proposal in an idealistic situation.
Yeah.
All these things could be implemented, but this is Sri Lanka that we're talking about. Let's look at that. How practical are these solutions?
Well, I think firstly, the first one, as I said, franchise is definitely everyone would agree.
Are you saying that
second one, second one would be accountability. Yes, we have practical issues, but then again, this country, this political elite, this political culture has failed us for so long, and we have to look for a solution now.
So are you saying that we need to go for an election immediately and get the people's franchise, get people's mandate, and then appoint a new president, a new prime minister?
I think that's better than having a parliament and a president without a mandate making decisions about our futures. I think that's more safe for us.
Way forward.
I think right now Sri Lanka needs reforms in every sector and every area, basically, be it the law enforcement, be it even parliamentarians who is appointed to parliament, accountability, like things like campaign financing, asset declarations laws, so that we get the right people appointed. So reforms across the board, reforms. Now, I mean, if you take today the budget, there's a huge budget deficit. We know the expenditure is higher than the income. Then there is the huge debt economy. So all these things, you need to look at the whole thing in a holistic perspective and get into reforms. To do reforms, there needs to be consensus among these political parties, which I think can happen, but which is not happening. Which should happen, because at the end of the day, we'll say we go for and then thereafter go for an election. But in interim period, 1 or 2 years, you need to make the hardcore decisions, and that can only happen if they all collectively agree. Because what we see is politically people pulling out sides, and at the end of the day, the taxpayer, the people's interest, nobody has people's interest at heart. So do that reforms for the next one year, at least next 18 months, and then go in for election. But if that is not possible, then immediately go in for an election.
But Lini, that is not the stand of your political party.
I told what is right, but right now. But if that is not happening, it should be elections. If that is not happening, then it should be elections.
So let's say you're saying the next 2 years we have to bite the bullet and...
See, I want to bring this point.
Yeah.
Harsha De Silva presented a plan, a consolidated plan on what are with the 10 points on what should happen. And then there was this whole discussion of having a consensus government, but that failed. Now, because that failed, we are talking about elections. But that if that happened, I think, you know, most of these problems
start from this point onwards,
would have been addressed.
From this point
then
onwards.
it has to be elections. Then it has to be elections going to the people, because the present parliament, though it's legitimate, it doesn't have the legitimacy. Because now we had an Aragale, we had people speaking out, and whatever that is happening there is not the will of the people.
So Migar, that's interesting. Now Lehini is saying 2 years, let's wait, and then let's look at the mandate of the people. Are you in agreement with that?
I think we have been taxed very heavily, both economically, socially and politically, with the decision making of this government. The question we ask is, what mandate do they have? What mandate does this president have to repress us? To suppress our dissent, to suppress our rights? They have nothing. So therefore, I think we need rulers who are making decisions about our future, about our lives, to do that with a mandate. Without that, we cannot afford
Say
that.
we go for elections without changing our campaign finance regulations, asset declarations, the welfare politics. We will have the same set of people coming in. How will we have change? It will be just a change of heads. But we need new people, we need quotas, we need young people coming in, we need more women coming in. That can only happen through reforms.
There's a good question. I want to pose this question to Tyagi from one of our viewers. Can we just blame the politicians and the 225 as it is the people who elected them?
So
we are pointing the finger at the politicians who are doing all this now, while it's us. We all are part of electing these 225 members to parliament.
I agree, but it's also, you have to take into account what what drove people, what awareness was there for them to make these decisions. Like Gehan pointed out, there's been a fantastic propaganda machine. There's been some of the biggest media houses sort of, backing campaigns of some of the politicians, right? So, and now some of the first-time voters who came into the booths, voted this time, realized what a mistake they made, were the same ones who were so annoyed about what was going on in the country. And it's those same people, the youth, who came to the roads and started protesting because they're like, this is not what we voted for. I just also want to add, there are some quick human rights wins. We're talking about, we talk about all the negatives all the time, that, everything's doom and gloom. But actually the government, even now, is in a position to make some really quick wins on human rights. And that's important especially in this environment where Sri Lanka is really relying on the international community's support. Repeal the PTA, that's the first thing. The public is calling for it in a way that no one has before. Earlier it was the Tamil community, then the Muslim community, and now the Sinhalese community has also woken up to its abuses.
Tyagi, you just cited international cooperation. What are the fingers that they can point at us when there is police brutality very proactively happening in the UK and in the US?
It's not about...
What is the reform they can enforce?
So I think the UPR process is somewhere where peer review system is there, but actually Sri Lanka's obligations are derived from the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, which is something Sri Lanka as a state signed up to. So that's really where the obligation comes. Right. Can I quickly go to the second, third, and fourth?
Yeah.
Abolishing the death penalty. I don't think anybody really wants it. It's 2022. Who really even has that? I mean, we're talking about Iran these days and the death sentences that are being handed out to protesters. Getting rid of it, even though there's a moratorium on it, easy win. Repealing 365 and 365A. It's 2022. People should be able to love who they want. Amending the Muslim Marriages and Divorces Act. Children as young as 12 should not be able to get married. And then one of the things linked to the accountability question is really having an independent prosecutor's office, because you can't have the Attorney General's Department prosecuting human rights violations and crimes while also being the spokesperson for the government and government entities.
Right.
Quick 5 wins, I think we could.
Rahaz, any questions?
Yes, Lehini, what would you say for a young woman who is to enter politics? Any advice from that side?
I think it's time that women take more center stage to come into politics. I mean, if you're really passionate about, contributing towards decision making in this country, of course, you need to come forward. Of course, political environment, political machinery is not fair and square, but then there are women who will obviously assist. And it is not, women in politics is not as it was back then. It is changing, it is evolving, and more women should definitely come to take center stage.
Shan, do you want to do a quick recap of the solutions?
So first, regarding the issues that were identified, of course, firstly, we spoke, I think Gehan identified certain issues, meaning that the current norm in society is the limitations to freedom, and the exception is freedom itself, but that shouldn't be the case, he said. The norm should be freedom, the exceptions should be the limitations. Also, moving forward, Bigara, he spoke about the misconceptions among public officials, because they think that they serve the political elite in this country, when in reality they serve the people and their duty lies to the people. Also, I believe Lehini highlighted the fact that politicians have a lot of power here in Sri Lanka. She was she was grilled quite hard on whether she has power also, and whether she wishes she had that much of power. But her perspective on this was that politicians who have power must use it for the right reasons, for the welfare of the society. And of course, Tyagi highlighted the fact that since we spoke so widely about the recent manner in which a female parliamentarian from the Samaga Jana Balawegaya acted in front of the police officers, she highlighted the fact that that is a little bit discriminatory against women, and highlighted the fact or the conduct of male parliamentarians in parliament, and questioned us as to if they were brought up regarding their conduct. Also, the solutions that were identified to some of the issues that were discussed on the shows. I believe Gehan highlighted the fact that it is important for us to safeguard the means to the solution, because without the means, we will have no solution altogether. And by means, what he meant was freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and he also highlighted the importance of freedom of media, so that we can discuss these issues and come to a certain consensus on these matter. Moving on, we also had Migara, who spoke about the requirement or the need for a government with a mandate. He called for immediate elections. And next we had Lihini, who spoke and said that reforms is the way forward. She said that during an interim period before the elections, certain mandatory reforms need to be made, election financing laws to eradicate corruption, and various other reforms to increase female representation in parliament, to increase youth representation in parliament and other governing bodies. These reforms must be made, and then we need to go to an election. She also added that if these reforms are not being made, then we need to immediately go for an election. That's pretty much of a roundup of the matters that were discussed here today. Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that. At the end of the day, what's important is to have accountability, and this is a nation that has gone through a lot, and at least now we have to see a light end of this tunnel, and there should be a glimmer of hope. We are all citizens of this nation who's looking at the future and thinking that what is in store for us as far as Sri Lanka's future is concerned. Thank you very much, Tyagi Ruwan Patrina, Amnesty International South Asia. That's the organization she was representing today on the show. Attorney at Law Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, human rights lawyer and activist, and Attorney at Law Migara Dosh, a civil and public law practitioner. Thank you very much, Migara, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation, your first time. And thank you very much, Attorney at Law Lehini Fernando, representing the SJB as well as the Municipal Councillor. Thank you very much, Shania. Thank you very much, Ruhaza. Thank you very much, Charlene, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. It means a great deal to those who are oppressed to know that they are not alone. Take care and good night.